All right, can you hear me?
Yep, everything's coming in clear, Andy.
Great. All right. So I'm going to start by naming the dominant political and cultural trend line in the United States that we're seeing here as well as globally. And that is one of accelerating authoritarianism and rising fascism. Now, the authoritarian coalition that's currently constituted as MAGA has, as we know, captured much of the federal judiciary and could possibly win the executive branch. And if they were to do so, plan to remake the state apparatus into an electoral autocracy. MAGA has already captured governing power, again, as we know, in close to half of the states. And so what we currently already see in the United States is a system of what we might call federated authoritarianism. So today I want to offer to contextualize this larger political project of which Project 2025 is a part of. And Project 2025 is perhaps best not thought of as the political project itself, but as the partial documentation of a broader authoritarian plan that also contains notable fascist elements. And blocking the implementation of Project 2025, therefore, is necessary, but that alone won't defeat this broader authoritarian movement that undergirds it. So to help contextualize Project 2025 within this larger, broader national and indeed global landscape, although we don't have much time to talk in this series about the larger global landscape in which this is situated, I want to start by defining what we mean when we say that Project 2025 is an authoritarian project with fascist elements. So by fascism, we mean an ultra-nationalist, anti-democratic, and far-right movement. And within this movement, people who are in the dominant racial, ethnic, and religious groups see themselves as victims, fighting against marginalized communities for their survival. Fascists believe that democracy has failed them and allowed for their victimization. And therefore, they seek to eliminate both democratic processes and marginalized communities to revive a fictitious and glorified past where their power once reigned unchecked. Fascism is often, but not always, obsessed with racial purity, but it accepts a degree of multiracial cooperation to advance its aims. Fascism is ultra-masculinist and militantly patriarchal, and we'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. And it celebrates the use of violence to accomplish its political ends. And that includes the elimination of its rivals, I think something that we might feel is familiar to us recently. Fascists generally seek a totalitarian state, that is, one ruler, one party, and no dissent. And the activation of political violence against its named enemies is fascist. And this is unfolding before our eyes to block the transition of presidential power, for example, to drive civil servants, such as election workers or governors or members of Congress from office, to normalize violence against different groups of people, including and particularly Black people, trans people, immigrants, Muslims, and Jews. And these are among the signs of rising fascism. And we are witnessing full-blown fascist rhetoric in the United States. And I want to talk a little bit about authoritarianism, talk a little bit about the overlaps as well as some of the differences. So authoritarianism is not the same thing as fascism. By authoritarianism, we're talking about a form of governance that allows some level of pluralism. So this might look like legal challenges or often unions, religious institutions, elections with a sanctioned opposition party. Despite these democratic pretenses, governing power in authoritarian regimes is highly concentrated, and elections are seldom able to displace a ruling strongman or party. And that's where this term electoral autocracy comes in. So unlike fascism, authoritarianism can have many different ideological expressions. So we could see this across the political spectrum, for example, with Ortega's Nicaragua. So the MAGA coalition includes a variety of factions that cooperate and compete for dominance. This includes Christian nationalists, Christian theocrats, libertarians, tech and petro oligarchs, including some neoliberals, and yes, indeed, some fascists. And they are united around a program of state capture and permanent minority rule. And this is what we'll see in Project 2025. So what we are witnessing in the United States today is rising fascism alongside and within a coalitional strategy of authoritarianism and electoral autocracy. And this is the underlying political project of which Project 2025 is a manifestation and a part and a tool to implement that we want to get at today. So we don't have to be left guessing what their governing agenda and strategy is. That's not only because it's well underway across the United States and the states, so we can see what they actually already are doing, but it's also laid out for us in Project 2025, which many will be familiar with now. So this is a 900-page blueprint for authoritarianism in the United States, and that's what we're going to be analyzing here together in this deep dive series. So Project 2025, I'm going to give it a little bit of a recap. This is an officially nonpartisan presidential transition plan published last year by the Heritage Foundation, which is itself a nonprofit 501c3 organization. It was designed for the, quote, next conservative president, whoever he or she may be. And its first few pages begin with a brief foray into the past that reminds us of an earlier iteration of the Heritage Project that had drafted a first presidential transition plan for the Ronald Reagan administration in 1980. And we will be reminded that by the end of his first term, and they remind us in Project 2025, they boast that Reagan had implemented 60% of that agenda. So while presidential transition plans are customary, I want to stress that this one is not just different in degree, but truly different in kind. And Project 2025 makes this really clear up front. They write, quote, it's not 1980, it's 2023, and the game has changed. Indeed. So the authors of Project 2025 describe a political landscape in which they have lost political and cultural ground, right? A time of lost power and victimization, which I just alluded to in my previous slide. And they seek to recover that lost ground, quote, and then some, by fundamentally restructuring government and society in order to consolidate permanent governing power for an authoritarian coalition that this time won't be able to be undone or weakened through those pesky democratic processes, at least not this time around. In other words, as Project 2025 director, former director Paul Dan said, quote, this is not a white paper, it's a battle plan. And elsewhere, he's stated that it's a plan to, quote, institutionalize Trumpism, which is a political project that exceeds Trump himself, despite, as we know, Trump's well-known efforts to distance himself from the plan. So the hopeful start date of Project 2025 is included in his first complete sentence of the mandate for leadership, and that is, quote, 12 noon on January 2025. So for those of us who've been tracking and analyzing Project 2025, as we do here at PRA, we also know that authoritarianism is already here. And much of what is in the plan is already well underway, especially in the states. And we will talk a little bit about that today. Another point I want to make is that Project 2025 is not really a single project, but rather brings together disparate, though sometimes overlapping political projects that include those of Christian theocrats, white nationalists, deregulation libertarians, tech and petro oligarchs, conspiracy theorists, and others who have united, as I mentioned before, through a common means to bring about their own ends, whether that might be this, ending the separation of church and state to transform the United States into a Christian nation, by removing all obstacles to unfettered extractive industry profit-making, or structurally entrenching white minority rule. So the plan has been endorsed by more than 100 anti-democratic organizations. Those include folks like Stephen Miller's Fascist America First Legal, Tony Perkins' Christian Nationalist Family Research Council, and many others that you're sure to recognize. And it's been backed by $22 million and counting from well-known dark money sources like Leonard Leo and Donors Trust, among others. The project has 4 pillars. The first is the mandate for leadership. This is the 900-page comprehensive policy agenda to dismantle and remake every department, facet, and agency of the federal government. And it's mostly what we're focused on analyzing in this series. But it's also important to take note that the full-fledged political project that backs up this document includes as well a training academy that is already underway that teaches incoming staff how to implement Project 2025, a personnel database of loyal, pre-vetted staff, and a 180-day playbook that is full of ready-to-implement executive orders and other plans. So when implemented together, these policies and personnel will enable whoever holds the office of President of the United States to wield virtually unchecked power over the executive branch. That is the goal. And to weaponize the federal government against their personal enemies, political opponents, the media, and indeed civil society. So removing those democratic checks and balances will clear the way to implement Project 2025's vision for the United States. And that vision is laid out here in its 4 primary goals. The first, restoring, again, that language of restoration, the family as the centerpiece of American life and to protect our children. We're going to talk about this goal at length later on in this presentation. To dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to the American people, or as Project 2025 authors would call it, the quote, deep state. To defend our nation's sovereignty, borders, and bounty against global threats, and to secure our God-given individual rights to live freely, what our Constitution calls the blessings of liberty. So these are the 4 goals that Project 2025 lays out. And we're going to be talking about these in depth in the course of this and our following series of presentations on Project 2025. So finally, I want to point out that just as important as it is to recognize the magnitude of the threat that is presented by Project 2025, it's also as important to recognize the magnitude of our collective power. And in that vein, before we go any further on this deep dive on Project 2025, I want to tell you about how we here at PRA suggest a simple 2-part framework for responding to the threat that is Project 2025. And the first is to block. We believe we must develop plans to disrupt the implementation of Project 2025 at the executive, legislative, and administrative levels. This means throwing up every roadblock possible, whether that's legal, procedural, insider disruption, whatever it takes. Our people who understand executive branch departments should be doing scenario planning so that we're ready to move. And we need to do this to build the broadest anti-MAGA and pro-democracy coalition that we can muster. The second is to build the infrastructure and exercise the audacity that is required in this moment to achieve and to govern a multiracial, feminist, democratic society. So to exercise and concretize our own radical democratic imagination. This is what it means to build, to be as bold in the pursuit of freedom and justice as our adversaries are in their pursuit of power and domination. And with that, let's dig in to better understanding the threat as we consider why we must block Project 2025 and how we'll do so, as well as we consider the world that we want to build together. So there are further resources that I know we'll be providing you in addition to this series of 3 webinars that we'll be happy to share out afterwards. And with that, I will pass it on to our next segment.
Okay, thank you, Annie, for that framing and getting us ready to hear more specifically how Project 2025 will impact our fight for reproductive justice and gender justice. And so I want to bring you and our colleague Chancey back to the mic to talk through this gendered analysis of Project 2025. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Okay, so here we want to discuss go into a deep dive on how Project 2025 specifically impacts reproductive and gender justice. So to understand how Project 2025 impacts reproductive justice, birthing people, women, and LGBTQ people, we need to unpack its number 1 stated goal that I discussed earlier, which is to restore the family as the centerpiece of American life and protect our children. And this statement guides and orients all the policy prescriptions in the plan and encapsulates the Christian theocratic vision that Project 2025 comprehensively lays out for the United States. And this is a vision that's inherently at odds with the basic principles of secular pluralism, equality, and self-determination. And quite on the contrary, it seeks to wield state power to control and regulate sex, gender, sexuality, and reproduction, to bring them into alignment with what Christian nationalists or dominionists have called their, quote, biblical worldview, which is a very particular construct. And we want to stop and remind folks that when we say their view here, we want to emphasize this is not a universal interpretation or representation of Christian views, but rather reflects a narrow and specific Christian nationalist and or Christian dominionist view.
And life here in this context is explicitly defined as beginning at conception and is to be protected by the state, laying out the basis for the draconian criminalization of exercising self-determination over one's body, including through seeking routine healthcare like abortions or even contraception. Family here stands in for a very particular racialized and Christianized understanding of the natural or nuclear family as marriage between one man and one woman with biological children, in which all members are cisgender and heterosexual, and men exercise dominion over the family. All government policy is designed to privilege, center, and protect this social, political, and economic arrangement by instrumentalizing this, quote, family unit as an extension of the state. And all alternatives are erased or framed as a threat and potentially criminalized. In other words, what Project 2025 does is to assign cisgender women the role of bearing children as the primary social and biological reproducers for the nation, erase queer and trans people from society, and put men, ideally white men, in charge of enforcing it all. So now let's break down first all of this with a look at how this impacts the aims of repro justice. So the reproductive justice framework consists of 3 tenets. It ensures the right of people to decide whether or not to have children and to raise them in safe and sustainable environments. Project 2025 threatens all of these rights by imposing control over reproduction, reproductive choices, and limiting support for families, particularly those in marginalized communities who are already facing mounting inequities. With regard to the right to have a child, Project 2025 will make it harder for LGBTQ families and single prospective parents to have children by imposing a ban on IVF through the concept of fetal personhood, which affords the right to life to embryos from the moment of conception, which would then call the morality of IVF into question. It will cut Medicaid coverage, leaving many children uninsured, particularly in low-income families. The plan will also eliminate the Head Start program, depriving parents of childcare options, cut school meals, and undermine public education by abolishing the Department of Education. By promoting privatized schooling, Project 2025 further limits educational access and resources for children and their families. Coupled with tax reforms that shift the burden from the wealthy to the middle class, these policies deepen financial inequality and widen the gap between the rich and low-income families. Project 2025 seeks to infringe upon the right to not have a child, first by instituting a federal abortion ban with minimal exceptions. It aims to invoke the archaic Comstock Act to restrict the distribution of obscene materials via the US Postal Service. For context, this is a Victorian-era law that refers to contraceptives, abortion pills, pornography, and any written material about these as obscene items. Of even greater concern is the weaponization of federal surveillance systems to track pregnancies and miscarriages to enforce this abortion ban. This infringes upon the right to medical privacy for birthing people. Beyond reproductive rights, Project 2025 jeopardizes the right to a safe environment for children. By dismantling the Environmental Protection Agency's enforcement powers and rolling back climate change policies, it endangers public health, especially for vulnerable communities. The plan promotes fossil fuel extraction and seeks to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, hindering efforts to combat climate change. The project plans to cut social safety nets like SNAP benefits and impose work requirements for welfare, which would disproportionately harm single mothers and low-income families. Additionally, the project seeks to amend the Fair Labor Standards Act to allow minors to work in housing, arguing that some teenagers wish to pursue these high-risk professions and that the act unfairly limits their opportunities to do so. In reality, this act, passed nearly a century ago, was designed to protect children's health and ensure their access to education without exploitation. In essence, Project 2025 not only undermines reproductive rights, but also limits access to healthcare and education, weakens environmental protections, exploits minors for labor, and deepens existing socioeconomic inequities.
Thank you, Chancey. Now I want to share a little bit more about the impacts of Project 2025 on LGBTQ people. They are, in short, devastating, especially for trans people. So one of the most significant aspects of Project 2025 is that it does not accept the very premise that gender exists, and instead seeks to, as I put it, quote, make gender sex again, by literally eliminating any use or reference to the word gender from, quote, every federal rule, agency regulation, grant, and piece of legislation that exists, as well as gender equality, gender diverse individuals, gender aware, gender sensitive, gender equity, abortion, sexual and reproductive rights, sexual health, sexual orientation, controversial sexual education materials, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in other words, a way to understand this is that Project 2025 seeks to make cis heteropatriarchy great again and to restore it as the basis of federal law and policy, that family model that we talked about earlier. So in their terms, this means that law and policy would be oriented towards prioritizing and protecting those who conform to a rigid sex binary in which cisgendered straight men are, quote, naturally dominant over their cisgendered and folks and straight women. For women, equality with men is neither a goal nor an expectation, and those whose sexual orientation is other than heterosexual can expect state-sanctioned efforts to suppress their sexuality, including through publicly funded conversion therapy, rollbacks of public accommodation laws, and anti-discrimination protections. And for trans people, Project 2025 seeks not only to push them out of public life and back into the closet, but also back into the gender that they were assigned at birth by, for example, banning gender affirming care, not only for minors, but also for adults to the extent that it's possible. And secondly, restricting access to information and expression through banning and criminalizing, quote, pornography, which is a concept that can be very broadly interpreted and applied to include anything from books that discuss gender to health information, or even public expressions of affection or even one's own gender nonconformity. So this is a sneaky way to potentially criminalize gender diversity. Also, a gendered analysis of Project 2025 also requires that we look beyond its explicit policy prescriptions, aimed at reproductive justice or LGBTQ people, that are aimed at control of those populations, efforts to control information about and the movements, the rights, and the bodily autonomy of queer people, birthing people, and women. It's imperative that we also see how Project 2025 aims to direct the distribution, not only of control, but wealth and power in society in ways that maintain and perpetuate already, of course, existing economic, political, and social hierarchies in society. So specifically, Project 2025 represents an effort to arrange an even further massive upwards transfer of wealth and power in the United States, which are deeply entwined, of course, in the United States system, wealth and power, such that these are even more concentrated among the few. So this not only reinforces white minority rule and economic inequalities and the dominion of men in society, it also hardens against efforts to change this. And we see this when we look at Project 2025 through the lens of distributional justice, that is, how equitably or not both benefits in society as well as risks in society are distributed. So in this light, we see how Project 2025 either dismantles or even weaponizes the mechanisms of government that can be used to redistribute wealth and power in society. So these mechanisms include, among others, common goods like education, public education, the tax code, which can directly redistribute wealth, or our regulatory system, which seeks to limit people's exposure to risk or to redistribute risk, and the public safety net, most importantly, or what we might call the welfare system, which indirectly redistributes wealth in society. So Project 2025's perhaps sneakier destruction and or seizure of these redistributive mechanisms of government to reinforce racial, economic, and gendered hierarchical orders isn't a byproduct of this project, it's by design. And that is the key point we want to make here. And though it's beyond the scope of the presentation today, it's important to note that while these equalizing mechanisms have failed to achieve a high degree of distributional justice in the United States so far, and furthermore have been actively eroded over decades of deregulation and privatization and under-resourcing under neoliberalism, it is important to note that it remains the case that they also serve as a crucial modulating factor for millions of people who are disproportionately people of color, women, and queer people. And so the coalition that is backing Project 2025 knows this, and in part it's why they are targeting these mechanisms. So we see this in promises to, for example, eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in all of public life, which can and has been used to shutter efforts like dedicated student services for marginalized students. News today comes out of Wisconsin that shows that after the Supreme Court's decision last year, already enrollment of students of color has fallen by half. This eliminates access to public education. We also see it in attacks or defunding to help defund civil society. So this can and has been used to defund institutions, for example, like LGBTQ community centers. We see it in attacks on labor unions and labor protections and unions, which disproportionately safeguard women as well as people of color who are significantly concentrated in informal and low-paid labor sectors. It seeks to eliminate Head Start, which Chancey talked about, which is a program that since 1964 has enabled millions of parents and a disproportionate number of single mothers to enter the labor force, to earn higher incomes, and to reach higher educational attainment, while providing early education to their children that's been shown to improve their lives across a wide range of indicators, again, disproportionately distributed. It also cuts SNAP benefits, whose recipients are vastly overrepresented by queer people, people of color, and women who themselves who in 2018 made up nearly 2/3 of all non-elderly SNAP beneficiaries, and 1 out of every 2 of them was a woman of color. Medicaid benefits, a similar situation. Its enrollees are disproportionately women and people of color as well. Student debt relief. This impacts Black women in the United States, especially, who carry almost half of all student loan debt. And this is at twice the rate of white women and 3 times the rate of white men. It also erodes and guts universal public education, again, by design. This is one of the landmark achievements of Reconstruction and the formerly enslaved people and their allies who advocated for the United States to ensure a free education for all. And it erodes or eliminates environmental protections at the uneven expense of people of color and women, conditioned in part due to their disproportionate economic precarity already in the US society. So the implementation, this is like a smattering of examples, but the implementation of Project 2025 translates into an even more inequitable and unjust distribution of wealth and power than the one that we already have. and it preempts future possibilities for intervention. And this conforms with Project 2025's underlying vision for government, which is that it should not play a role in redistributing wealth or power in society, a view that's justified by a denial that inequality exists in the first place, or by the assertion that it's already been overcome, or by the insistence, importantly, that racial and or gender inequity or other forms of hierarchies in society is natural and inevitable. So I'll pass it to Chancey to talk a little bit about how we're seeing Project 2025 already unfolding.
Thanks, Annie. Thanks for that really helpful graphic. It's great. So yeah, it would be misleading to only talk about Project 2025 in the future tense. In fact, under the current system of federated authoritarianism that currently characterizes the US, a great number of policies outlined in Project 2025 that we've mentioned are already in place in many states. And as such, the impacts of Project 2025 are already being felt at both the state and local levels. In April 2024, a man in Texas requested a court order to investigate those who assisted his ex-girlfriend in having an abortion in Colorado amid Texas's 6-week abortion ban. The man planned to go after anyone who, quote, aided and abetted the murder of his unborn child. Even though crossing state lines to have abortions in states that provide abortion access is legal, this pending lawsuit and others like it are fear-mongering tactics to confuse those who are seeking or who hope to help someone who is seeking abortion access. Abortion abolitionists hope the threat of criminalization alone will stop folks from seeking abortions or assisting others in finding care. Likewise, many of the plans that Project 2025 lays out for LGBTQ people are already in place. For example, as of August 2024, 39.4% of 118,300 trans youth aged 13 to 17 are living in the 26 states that currently have bans on gender-affirming care. Book bans and or bans on curricular content mentioning LGBTQ people or families are already in place in jurisdictions across the country, and librarians have already found themselves as suspects in criminal investigations. This quick clip we have here from the body cam of a Texas constable confronting librarians of a local school library in Granbury, Texas, for harboring allegedly obscene content helps us visualize just what kind of society we can expect from the hypercriminalization pushed by Project 2025.
I'm doing a criminal investigation into some of your staff, so as a courtesy, I want to talk to you before I go into your schools. Essentially, the librarians are my suspects. If they're the ones that are choosing the books and putting them in there, they're the ones that are carrying the criminal liability.
Thank you, Chancey. That's terrifying. It gives us a good sense of the obsession with control, power and control that we're seeing in Project 2025. And as you mentioned, the ways that it's already rolling out across the states.
Definitely. And luckily we have innovative campaigns like The Care Machine by Autumn Brion, a Black queer activist and performance artist. The Care Machine is a traveling pink vending machine installation sponsored by the organizations Plan C and Feminist. The vending machines have been retrofitted with care items such as lip gloss, pads, books, Narcan, abortion pills, tampons, condoms, edge control, etc., among other things, all of which are free of charge. This kind of campaign is important because it links abortion resources to common care items, showcasing that abortion is care. It also combats misinformation and fear-mongering by disseminating resources and making folks aware of other resources that are available to them. In addition, an installation and ad campaigns such as this one would be incredibly useful if the Comstock Act is enforced in the way that it is laid out in Project 2025. Additionally, queer, feminist, and trans movements in states across the country are gaining ground and blocking anti-LGBTQ bills using transgender moral panic as an electoral issue. For example, in 2023, Moms for Liberty centered their anti-trans policies in schools and lost 70% of their races. And polling shows that a majority of Americans view this tactic as a distraction and oppose bans on gender-affirming care for youth.
Yeah.
I believe that's what we have. Thank you all for listening.